So the Circle Center is very, very fortunate this evening to have a expert and scholar. Zoe Newell started studying yoga when she was 14 years old at the feet of Sri Brahmananda Saraswati. And she's studied ever since, got oodles and oodles of credentials. She's a certified yoga therapist. She is the author of the award-winning book, Downward Dogs and Warriors. Beautiful book, beautiful pictures, including many that look like Megababa but are not.
There are two
Shiva.
on sale.
And there are two on sale. And she received her master's degree in theology from Harvard University Divinity School and her doctorate in history of religions from Vanderbilt University.
Wait, say those two things again. Her master's from Harvard.
Her master's degree in theology from
Theology.
Harvard Divinity School.
Oh.
That's Harvard. That's the big. That's the. We used to call it in Nashville the Northern Vanderbilt. And she received her doctorate in history of religions from the Southern Harvard.
The Southern Harvard.
Yeah. Vanderbilt University. Please join me in welcoming the esteemed Dr. Zoe Newell.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out on this kind of nasty
But warm day.
but warm day. Yes. So I wanted, let me first say a few words about this book, Downward Dogs and Warriors. As Jamie said, I was introduced to yoga when I was 14 by a teacher who was a storyteller. He was Indian, and he was long story about him, but he came from a lineage of teachers, and apparently his father was known in certain circles for being one of the people who knows like oral versions of stories that have never been written down. And so this was all very spontaneous for him. I can remember, a woman was feeding her baby, one of the women at the ashram, and he said, "Oh, do you know the story about how Krishna's mother saw the universe in his mouth?" And I said, "No," and so he told that story. And so he incorporated stories into daily life just very, very naturally. And I was enchanted by that and kept, reading mythology and so on. And when I was much older, when I was grown up, I was at a teacher training program in Canada, led by Judith Lassiter. We were talking about how emotions come up. It's sort of like you could say that yoga poses just carry a certain energy, and it's not strictly physiological. But anyway, and what to do if you're the teacher and your student, one of your students, becomes tearful or just seems to be really having a strong emotional reaction to what we're doing, how to handle that. So we talked about that some. And this one woman in the training shared that she had been in a class, I think, where the guy on the mat next to her seemed to be giving off this rage, and it really kind of spooked her. And the teacher had not noticed or had not addressed this in any way. And so this had kind of stayed with her, and she brought that up as an example of what can happen in a class if emotions aren't addressed or aren't sort of somehow normalized. Somebody said, "Well, what pose were you in?" And she said, "Warrior 2." And so Virabhadrasana too. And so I piped up and said, oh, well, that's really interesting because you all know the story about this pose, right? And nobody did. So they said, well, will you tell us? And I told it. And I will tell it to you later. Yeah. And so at a break, somebody said, well, that was really interesting. Can you recommend a book? Some books that talk about this connection. And we all realized that, no, we couldn't. There were no books. There were books that mentioned something about, in relation to a certain pose, but nothing that really went into the stories in relation to the poses. So I thought, well, I'm going to write that book. Mm-hmm. And everybody, including Judith, said, you do that. And Judith, being the wife of an attorney, got a verbal commitment from everybody at the table that they would not now jump in and do that themselves, that they would respect my desire to do that. So I did. And that is this book. And it draws on stories about Shiva, who is the Lord of Yogis. Shiva is the first yoga teacher, the first yogi. His wife Parvati is the first student. So this is all stories and images that have to do with them. I'm just putting finishing touches now on a manuscript for my next book, which will be entitled Flying Monkeys, Floating Stones, which draws on stories from the Ramayana. And I'm not sure. We had said it's going to be out this spring, and now I'm wondering, because it's already almost February, so I'm thinking it may be fall rather than spring, in any case. So that's kind of the history. And people, one of the things that I realized in this experience in Canada was that even experienced teachers, even serious yoga students, don't know zip about these stories. They're Indian culturally, and not a lot of people are familiar with them. So one of the things that I can do is to share them, because I think knowing them makes it much more fun when you're practicing yoga. And the stories themselves are fuel for self-reflection in a very valuable way. So I want to read something that's part of the intro to the current book that talks a bit about that. Indian literature embraces a genre known as Itihasa. It so happened. This class of stories includes the great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, as well as the vast body of wisdom literature known as Puranas. Itihasa is often rendered in English as mythology, but this term can confuse English speakers because we have so devalued our mythic tradition that we now understand myth to mean something false, something not evidence-based. Our word mythology comes from the Greek, but myths abound in every culture. They are stories, often, though not necessarily related to that culture's religious system, which explain things like the nature of the universe, the origins of things, and how we human beings are to live in right relationship to the world in which we find ourselves. So myths are teaching stories. Understood psychologically, the characters in a myth are symbols, aspects of our unconscious minds. So I would say that through myth, collective psychology expresses itself in stories very much as individual psychology expresses itself in dreams. But whereas dreams tend to be about me, in my personal experience, Myths widen our perspective, and they let us see that the story is not strictly about us, but it has broader and maybe even universal importance. And reflecting on the characters and the events of a myth can provide us with insight into our own choices and characters by taking us below or beyond the surface of our usual personas and relationships and patterns of behavior, and lets us sort of see them in a bigger perspective. An example of and so myths are stories that can help us deal with situations that are confusing or inexplicable or just very, challenging, whether they are personal or collective. And while a situation may not be of our making, thinking about it symbolically can be extremely helpful, if only to calm our anxiety and help us to envision a positive outcome. An example is that shortly before Martin Luther King was murdered, he drew a parallel between himself as Moses and the people in the civil rights movement as the Israelites journeying through Egypt to escape slavery. In the story of the Exodus, Moses dies before the journey ends. He dies within sight of the promised land. But his people reach their goal. And so when Dr. King referred to this story, and said, I may not get there with you, that this sort of helped them to see their own experience in terms of like, oh right, this is the part of the story where Moses doesn't get there, but we do. So rather than just destroying morale and finishing the movement, it actually, it was a terrible thing, but it gave people hope, because it was like, okay, if this is the story we're living, then the end is in sight and success is going to be ours. So that's an example of a cultural collective use of myth to help allay anxiety. So the people in the civil rights movement did not fall into despair and give up. They carried on. In yoga, many asanas, poses, contain references to stories and symbols from these epics and itihasa. Although Americans may not immediately make the connection. Even if they don't, asana is a valuable tool for seeing the connections between what we do and how we are on the mat and how we are in our lives. So each yoga pose, each asana, gives us the opportunity to observe ourselves in a particular process or situation and notice, how do I approach the problem of, say, tight hamstrings, tight shoulders? If an action is difficult, do I trust that there is a way to make friends with the difficulty? Or am I angry or frustrated? If something's hard for me, do I look for somebody to blame? Do I go into a shame spiral? You can sort of see your own responses sometimes by just what happens on the mat. Do I feel that my body or the teacher or the pose is an enemy or a potential friend? What narrative about myself or the universe do I tell myself in this kind of situation? So there's that. There's observing the body and mind in the asana. And then there's the story. So I realize that you guys are mainly, some of you are yogis, but not all of you. And I don't, even though I've gotten into this in relation to asana and the yoga world, I don't want to restrict it to that. So I want to tell some of the stories and maybe open it up for a little discussion or reflection, and we can share what we come to about that. Yeah, so starting with downward dogs and warriors. Let's see. Well, yeah, starting with the warrior poses. Oh, so who's familiar with those? Yeah. All right.
I don't know. I did yoga quite a lot years ago, but I don't remember.
Linda, you want to show? You want to show warrior too?
No, no.
Come on.
No, I have tight jeans on. Don't you have a picture?
Well, yeah, but I don't have slides. Okay, so I'll do it. Yeah, so So this is the pose known as Warrior 2. Warrior 1. And there's a Warrior 3, but I'm just not going to go into that right now. But it's a thank you. Yeah. It's a pose that's familiar to most yoga students, and its Sanskrit name is Virabhadra. So, Shiva, who, as we know, is the Lord of Yogis and the Lord of the universe, was, as my teacher used to say, he comes in hippie's guise. He also was kind of a guy, somebody who lived on the fringes and had matted hair and smoked ganja and was kind of very much an outsider figure in many ways. But Shiva's first wife was Sati, the daughter of King Daksha. And Daksha's job, since the beginning of the world, was to oversee and regulate rituals and see that they were done properly. He was a Baptist deacon, or something like that, yeah. Ancient beliefs in India hold that an improperly conducted ritual can adversely affect the kingdom, while one done according to correct procedure benefits everyone. If you plan to invoke divine powers, you had better know how to do it right. Sati's parents did not see Shiva until the day of the wedding. Okay, so Sati has fallen in love with Shiva, and her parents were very much against this, as you can well imagine. So Sati's parents did not see Shiva until the day of the wedding. They had to take their daughter's word that he was the love of her life and the Lord of the universe. At an Indian wedding, the groom comes to the bride's house on horseback, accompanied by all his friends. Shiva arrived in his aspect of the Lord of the burial grounds, with long matted hair, his body covered in ashes, wreathed in snakes, and accompanied by a troop of ghosts and demons, all reeking of pong. Yeah. So it's like he rode up with his, with his biker gang. Sati knew him well enough not to be deceived by appearances, but her parents were appalled and wanted to cancel the wedding. finally, to please Sati, Shiva showed himself in his magnificent aspect, radiantly handsome, garlanded with gold, dressed in silk, and accompanied by splendid, deferential courtiers. That's more like it, thought Daksha, and allowed the marriage to proceed. But he held a grudge. A short time later, King Daksha sent invitations to everyone he knew, and a few he didn't know, to attend a splendid yagya at his court. A yagya is a religious ceremony, a sacrifice involving fire. It can go on for several days, and a king's yagya is a very special occasion indeed. No invitation came for Sati and Shiva. Surely, said Sati, with a sinking heart, he just forgot. Of course he means us to be there. Shiva was not so sure, or rather he was quite sure, but tried not to upset his wife. Your father doesn't like me, he said, and he knows where we live. If he wanted us there, he'd have said so. You go if you want, but I'm not going to make matters worse by crashing his party. I will, said Sati, and set off with her women companions for her father's house. It was clear that she was not welcome. Daksha and his friends said insulting things about her husband, her wedding, her taste in men, and their remarks got worse as the evening wore on. The yagya was a mockery of itself, with the Lord of the universe excluded and insulted. Daksha was offering nothing of real value. He was simply flaunting his own wealth and power. That one to whom all sacrifice ultimately comes was not present. The Vedas tells us that in a true sacrifice, God is the offering, the one who offers, the recipient, the flames, the fuel, the ritual. This was no sacrifice. Sati could not bear it. The flames roared. With one swift movement, she flung herself into the fire and was burned to ash, herself becoming the sacrifice. When Shiva heard what had happened, he was overcome with grief and fury. His eyes stood out, his blood boiled, his hair stood on end. In an ecstasy of rage, he tore a hair from his own head and flung it to the ground. The next moment, where the hair had been, stood a warrior, the personification of Shiva's emotions, red-faced and grunting with the lust for vengeance. This was Virabhadra, the personification of righteous anger and the noble impulse to defend the innocent. The warrior Virabhadra saluted Shiva, then flew to King Daksha's palace, where he ripped and roared through the sacrifice, destroying everyone and everything in his path. He tore off Daksha's head. There is more to the story of his depredations, but this is not the place to tell it. As for Sati, she was reborn as Parvati, this time with a father who supported Shiva and her love for him. As for Daksha, Shiva forgave him and restored him to life, but he had to live with the head of a goat. And in the three poses named for Virabhadra, we see a progression from the warrior offering his efforts to his higher power to one moving dynamically but with control into action. Okay? So we're not going to do the... If I were doing a weekend workshop or something, at this point, we would all do the pose in some version of the pose, and we'd do it again, and then we would talk or write or perhaps journal. I'm going to leave some of that out, but just reflect for a moment, or write if you have implements, about what your own physical or emotional symptoms of grief are. And think of a time, particularly, when you came to the defense of a righteous cause or an innocent person. Invite the emotional qualities of that experience into your practice of warrior pose. And if we were going to do it again, I would say keep that experience in mind and see if you could practice with soft eyes and an open heart. Because what often happens to people, especially if they have to hold this pose for a while, is you get kind of, your eyes get hard, and you get kind of tense and rigid in your body because it's challenging to stand like that. So is there a way to be both strong and soft and open? I want to read the next story, because that will cheer you up. Yeah, I find these stories just enormous. I love them, and I find them very moving. And well, yeah. So there is actually another one kind of in this series. It's not Virabhadra, but when Shiva learned what had happened and he went to Daksha's sacrifice, he picked up his wife's charred body and holding it in his arms, he began to dance. And there's a yoga pose known as King Dancer pose.
There's a yoga pose for that?
Well, there's a pose that's known as the King Dancer pose, Natarajasana.
Would you show us?
Yeah, would you show us?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't think I have I'm not sure I can, but it's, you stand on one foot, you stand on one leg and bring the other leg up over your head and hold it.
Oh,
Have you seen that?
We've seen that.
Yeah, okay, so.
Can you do it?
Angela, can you do
Angela.
Yes, I'll do it.
Yeah, okay. With her jeans on.
We understand why you don't want to do it.
Yeah, and there are ways to do it with support. Anyway, I did not come really prepared to do that, but yeah, but it's,
Wow.
yeah, and so he picks up her body and he begins to dance.
Mhm.
And he just can't let go. And because, yeah, so things start to kind of fall apart in the universe. This can't continue. And finally, Vishnu, who is the preserver, decides he's got to destroy Sati's body so that Shiva can let go of it. And he throws his discus and he begins to cut off bits of her body which fall throughout the continent of India, creating what are now many, many sacred places, sacred to the goddess. And people will say, this is where her finger fell, and so on. And eventually, he has to move on. He does move on. So, after a while, after he has to relinquish her body, then Shiva goes into a cave and meditates. After a long time, the goddess who had been Sati, Daksha's daughter, was reborn as Parvati, the daughter of Mount Himalaya. Her name means mountain. And places where two peaks come together are regarded as her breasts. Determined to win Shiva's love, the daughter of the mountain adopted an asceticism to rival his own. She dressed in bark garments like a yogi, fasted extensively, stood motionless for hours in asanas to hone her concentration and master her body and mind. Her discipline, her tapas, was so extraordinary that its energy inwardly communicated kinship to Shiva as he sat deep in meditation, and it roused him from his samadhi. In the form of a wandering mendicant accompanied by a dog, he intruded on Parvati's tapas and taunted her, casting aspersions on her resolve, her abilities, her qualifications as a renunciate, and ultimately on her ideal Shiva. Parvati preserved her equanimity as long as she was being insulted, but when it came to Shiva, she became passionate in his defense. So passionate that Shiva, pretending to be the renunciate, that Shiva's reserve finally melted. Even as she spoke, he revealed himself through his disguise. And when she recognized him, she fell silent, and the god and goddess were reunited. Their perfect unity, the way they form complementary halves of one another, is expressed visually in the form of Ardhanarishvara, which you may have seen. It's a figure which is half man, half woman. And on the left side of the body, it's got a bracelet and a masculine chest, and on the right side, that's the right side is the masculine. On the left side, on the feminine, there's long hair, there's an earring, she's got a bra, it's clearly a curved hip. Clearly this is a woman, but they are one. And the story, so it means half man, half woman, Ardhanarishvara. The story goes that Shiva's devotee, Phrigu, grew resentful of Shiva's intimacy with Parvati and wanted to separate them. He desired to worship only Shiva by circumambulating his body. But Shiva embraced Parvati so closely that not even a tiny insect could come between them. To free Phrigu from his jealousy, Shiva revealed himself as Ardhanarishvara, the Lord who is half man, half woman, both Shiva and Parvati inseparably, and the embodiment of non-duality. So, think about that a moment. What could that mean? To have a form of God that is physically male and female simultaneously. And of course it's not only that, but it embraces all the opposites. And do we sometimes want our own exclusive way of worshiping? Phrigu wants her to get out of the way so he can circumambulate Shiva. And Shiva says, no, that's impossible, we're inseparable. But might be some food for thought. Do we do that? I want to get these people out of the way because this is how I want to worship Baba. And Baba's like, nope, I'm not for it. No, I'm for everybody. So I hadn't gone there with this, but when I wrote this, but that's one of the things that comes to my mind now. Any questions so far? Yes.
I just want to mention, now that you're on that topic, that form of Shiva, and I wish I remembered all the details, but is invoked by Merwan Jesawala when he describes how when Baba was in an accident in the west, one side of his body was damaged, and when he was in the east, another side, and there was some correspondence between the feminine and the, I don't remember what it was, but he invoked Shiva in that form as a parallel to Baba's being damaged on both sides. It's something to think about.
That is interesting, yeah.
Who evoked?
Merwan Jesawala. There's an audio tape series on monleyhall.org of him telling his whole life, which is now being transcribed into a book. But in that, when he talks about Baba's injuries, he invokes Shiva and says that there's a parallel. So I don't remember what the parallel was, but between.
Well, yeah, in Indian iconography, well, not just that, but yeah, the right side of the body is masculine. The left side is feminine, and there are all kinds of qualities that are associated with masculinity and femininity. Strength, or softness, that kind of thing. And I think probably also east and west.
Yeah, well,
So that may
that's
have
the point he was making, but I don't remember what.
Right. So Baba was injured on the
Left side in America.
left side in America
With women.
with women. Okay.
And with all men, that's right, he was with all men.
Okay.
That's exactly.
And then the right side.
Right side in India with men companions.
And there are all women in the car with him in the U.S., there are all
Yeah.
men with him in the car in India.
Yeah. So that is interesting. Yeah.
And and that somehow relates cognitively to the way Shiva is represented.
Right.
Or that he was manifesting the damage in the West to the feminine aspect. That's how I always saw it.
Yeah, I'll try and dig up that quote by Marijuana. Sure, it would be old sometime.
There's another aspect, it's like when Jamie was doing his class, like the feminine, the woman's always looking for the male counterpart in herself.
Yes.
And the female's looking for the male, and so by being both like that, he had like the perfect relationships. Or,
Yeah.
Didn't Ramakrishna also, he was sometimes a woman and sometimes a guy?
In the early point of his sadhana, he manifested being like Sita. And they said that he became such a beautiful young woman in appearance that no one could tell that he was actually a man. But that was only in the earliest stage of his development before he became God realized. And another time he played at being Hanuman. And he got so involved with it, he used to jump from branch to branch. And they say his coccyx actually grew about a half an inch. So he had the beginnings of a monkey's tail.
Yeah.
Well, too, my thought as well was the embodiment of non-duality.
Yes.
That's what ultimately, when we become one with God at whatever place, it's great bliss or whatever, it's non-dual. We have to keep that non-duality. And he's manifesting it in human form.
Right. And so, of course, there's no one meaning here.
No,
but, yeah.
no, that's what's so cool about it.
Yeah. And that is one of the reasons I think it's great to talk about these myths and think about them because they will bring up something a little bit different, probably for each person. And of course, when you add in the asana, that's just another level of experience and food for reflection. So I want to talk a little bit about the coming book, which is stories from the Ramayana. Yeah. And you all know the story probably of Rama. and Sita. But as briefly as I can, as you know, Vishnu, the preserver, takes birth from time to time in human, or not always, but in human form as the avatar, in order to set something right on earth, to restore Dharma. And this time he came as Rama to settle some issues that were going on when the demon Ravana had basically taken over the earth. And very specifically, some of the demons were bothering the sages who lived in the Dandaka forest, which is modern Nasik. And they were wrecking their sacrifices and their rituals and just making everybody very unhappy. So Rama was born to King Dasharatha along with 3 other brothers. So it's an unusual incarnation because apparently this time the avatar came in four bodies simultaneously. But Rama was kind of the full incarnation or something. He was the favorite, he was the firstborn, and he was the obvious heir to the throne of the kingdom of Ayodhya. And just when he was about to take the throne, I mean, everything was set for it to be the next day. I mean, Dasharatha decided, Rama, he's wonderful, everybody loves him, why don't I just retire? And everybody said, great idea. But Dasharatha had 3 wives. One of the wives, Kaikeyi, was influenced by somebody in the court who just got really paranoid about this and convinced her that she should demand that her own son, Bharata, should be king, and Rama should be sent into exile. And the king, of course, did not at all want to do this, but he had to, because when they were young, this wife had been a warrior maiden, and she had saved his life on the battlefield. And at that time, he offered her 2 boons, payable any time. And as a righteous man and a king, he could not go back on his word. So that's what happened. Rama was sent into exile for 12 years. Sita goes along, his wife goes along with him, and one of the other brothers, Lakshmana. And then a lot happens. It's a long, complex story. Sita is kidnapped. They come to stay, basically they come and live in the forest where all these sages are being hassled by the demons, and they're perfectly happy. But one day, Ravana finds out they're there and shows up disguised as a wandering mendicant. He has sent one of the other demons ahead, and this guy has taken the form of a golden deer with jeweled eyes, and he comes and sort of frolics attractively outside the hut where they're staying. And Sita says, "Oh, the darling deer, get it for me, please. We can have it as a pet." And Rama says, I'm not so sure about this. I'm not sure if that's a real deer. And she says, oh, please, please. Anyway, so finally he agrees he'll go and hunt the deer, catch the deer. And he says, Lakshman, you stay with Sita, and Sita, you do what he tells you. You guys be safe. So he goes off, it's a demon, and he shoots it. But as it's dying, the demon imitates his voice perfectly and yells, Lakshman, Sita, help. And Sita says, oh my God, it's wrong. You've got to go help him. Lakshman says, he told us to stay here. She says, anyway, they argue. He says, Lakshman draws a magic circle around the house and says, do not step over this line and do not let anybody in. We'll be back. I'll be back. She says, okay. Now, with Lakshman away, Ravana shows up as saying, Prem se bhiksha dijiye, Ma, and he looks so inoffensive and so holy that Sita says, she says, come in. She invites him over the line, or she steps over it one. Anyway, and with that, he turns into his true form, which has 10 heads and 20 arms and is just fierce and horrible, and he flies away with her and to his island kingdom of Lanka and imprisons her there. Rama and Lakshman figure out pretty quickly that, something's happened, and they go after her, and a lot of the story has to do with their adventures in tracking her down and capturing her and so forth. But I wanted to talk for a minute about, the first pose I wanted to talk about is a sage twist, Bharadvajasana. And there are a lot of versions of this. Yeah. But basically, it's a twist. It's a twist. And it's named after one of the 7 sages. So Bharadvaja is living in the forest, performing austerities. One of his austerities is that every morning and every evening he imaginatively bathes Rama's feet. And he's done this for years now, and he's old. And as the 3 are approaching his ashram, somebody sees them, and Ramana calls this student over and says, please go give our respects to your teacher and tell him that we'd like permission to come into the ashram. My name's Rama. And the student goes and he says, there are these people and they look like, he looks like a deity. He looks like a deva. So Bharadvaja can't believe it and goes and greets him and of course invites him in and is so excited. He's got all his stuff in his hands because he's about to do this ritual, and he drops it and Rama helps him pick it up. And there's all this, oh my God, I've waited for you all my life kind of thing. And Rama says, finally, well, we apologize for intruding on your practice, and may we assist you now in completing it. And so Bharadvaja gets to actually wash Rama's feet. And he is supremely happy. And this story reminds me so much of stories about Baba, me encountering people when he was traveling. Darwin used to tell a story about going with him through the streets of Arangown, and Baba, I think that he was maybe even on top of his car or in his car, and this one lady came out and sort of fought her way through the crowd, and she had arti implements with her. She wanted so much to perform Baba's arti, and she was really afraid that she wouldn't be able to, and she got so excited that she was kind of dropping stuff and couldn't quite light the light, and Baba just waited, just stopped everything and waited so that she could do this. And maybe on that same occasion, but there was an occasion where there was some poor person who, again, really wanted to meet Baba and really wanted to do his arti, and thought, I'm just never even going to make it through these crowds. And Baba directed them to this person's house so that they could do his arti. And yeah, so I thought this is so beautiful, these stories about someone who spends years and years in devotional practice and envisioning what it would be like if I met the Lord. Not that I ever will, but if I, and then this happens, and how amazing that is. So that's one reason I included this story, just because I think it's so beautiful and because it really reminds me of Baba.
Getting a little Field of Dreams image here. If you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
Well, you weren't at the meeting last night, but there's a film of a scene like that, not the exact same thing, and Lisa wrote a whole song about it, which she sang and showed the film in Arrangown Village.
Nice synchronicity going
Yeah.
on here.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how does that connect with the twist?
Oh, just that it's named for Bharadvaja. There's a whole.
But I mean, how does that pose translate to his offering or his desire?
I don't know that it does, but there are various levels of this pose, from pretty simple, just sitting in a chair twisting, to
The lotus full spinal twist.
yeah. And so it can become very challenging, but because it is a twist, it's something where you may need to spend time and effort to get into that pose, to do that pose well, to kind of perfect that pose. And so for somebody who's learning to do that, it's not so much about him, it's about the practice and being patient and being persistent, and then once you're in it, you stay there for a while.
Right.
You don't just whip in and out. Yeah. So I feel like the pose, the physical pose embodies some of these qualities of persistence and
Patience being rewarded.
patience being rewarded. Thank you. I'm glad I haven't sent in this revised manuscript yet. Say that. Yeah. So when Rama and Sita and Lakshmana set out for exile in the forest, actually I think when they leave Bharadvaja, he says, okay, you want to go to the Dandaka forest, it's like over that way, you're going to have to cross a river. And they come to the edge of the river, and there is a place where you can cross. There's a ferryman waiting there. And of course, there's a lot of symbolism about in Indian cosmology about the ferryman and the one who, the Lord, the Lord who ferries us across the waters of samsara, and the guy who just rows you over in his little boat. Anyway, they meet this ferryman, and they say, whose name or whose title is Kevat. And they say, hey, Kevat, can you take us across? He recognizes them, or he suspects that this is Rama, and he knows, well, two things. One, he also would like to touch Rama's feet, but he also has heard this story about how Rama came upon a woman in the forest named Ahalya who had been turned into stone. And when his foot touched her, she was turned back into a living person. And there's a whole backstory to that. But he says, wait a minute, I think you're Rama, and I heard that your feet are magic, basically. My boat is small and your feet are magical, and how can I, what if you step foot in my boat and it turns into something else? So, I don't know. So they have to negotiate this a bit. Finally, he does agree to take them across, and does. And when they get...
So funny. I haven't heard this story before. I apologize.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, no, it is.
It's challenging the Lord of the universe.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Maybe he will turn into something else and I won't have my income and my business.
But this is really just a ploy because he really just wants to touch Rama's feet. But anyway, yeah, he says, I'm not going to do that. He might wreck my boat. So they do get across, and Rama offers to... Well, they have no money, but Sita does have a necklace. So they say, well, can we pay you with this necklace? And the boatman says, no. He says, we're Tumpi Kevat. You are also a boatman. We're in the same line of work, and so I can't charge you, but I sure would like to touch your feet. Can I wash your feet? And so Rama says, yes, of course. And the boatman washes his feet, and then Rama says to him, I promise you that as you've ferried us across this water, someday I will pull you out of samsara, out of the waters of illusion, which is the same thing that Baba said to Erich. So again, I kind of threw that in here. The book is, when I've been able to do a little quote or little hidden reference, I bring Baba into it. So that's, and again, the boat pose is, there are lots of versions. It's challenging to the abs. You're basically kind of sitting on the floor and holding your legs out and your arms out, and so it's not easy. It's a balance pose. It's some people have to do various things to make that doable. And that's something else to think about. Like, what gets you across the challenges of this pose? How do you? Most people don't just pop up into it the first time they try. What goes into it, and what are your fears? He's afraid. He says he's afraid that Rama's feet will ruin him. Are there things about succeeding in a challenging yoga practice what would be ruined if you succeeded? What would you have to give up? How would you need to think differently about yourself? Anyway, so that's so those are some of the stories And I'm thinking, maybe that's enough of me talking. And I'd like, I don't know, do you have, are there questions? Are there things that you want to add?
Did your what ashram did your master?
Ananda in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's affiliated with the San Francisco.
I've been there.
You
Yeah.
have?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What year was this that you were?
1964.
Ananda in Monroe,
Uh-huh.
yeah. Started by Dr. Mishra.
Yeah.
I've been there.
Who's a great
That's right.
Sanskrit
One of the earliest
scholar.
ones in the country, started in
Yeah.
64, I think.
Yep.
He brought the Hare Krishna guy over.
That's
He,
right.
he did. He sponsored him. Yeah.
So where did you learn the association between the story and the pose? Because, I mean, I've done some yoga, but I've never had the association with the poses, which really enrich it. I just want to say I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I really, I don't know, I love stories, and just made the whole thing so much richer for me to kind of hear the stories.
Well, as I said, it was just sort of associations that I made. But I had kind of learned to think like that from being around Dr. Mishra, Guruji. And, but then when I told this story at the teacher training and people said, well, is there a book? I was like, no, but, so I started thinking about that, and I realized pretty quickly that there were a whole bunch of stories that had to do with Shiva. So that was what I did for the first book. And
Well, what you're leaving out, Zoe, is that you have a sort of encyclopedic knowledge. You love these stories, you love to read, and so you know all these Shiva stories, you know all these Rama stories, whereas certainly most Western people do not. And so it's easier for you to make the associations than even people who know a lot of yoga or something.
yeah, well, and most people, right. I mean, that's just, it happens to be one of the weird ways that my mind works, is that I make these associations. Yeah, there are plenty of Indians who know the Ramayana very well and take yoga classes, but they don't necessarily go, oh, that's like this. I mean, Mr. Iyengar does a little bit of that, I will say, in Light on Yoga. There are sort of odd poses here and there where he does refer to a story to kind of illustrate that. But because he thinks like that too, apparently.
Does he do more Hanuman than...
No. Well, he has a story. Yeah, I mean, maybe just one more. Okay, about. No, it varies. But he does have a Hanuman story. And if any of you ever saw BKS Iyengar, he looks like Hanuman. I mean, there is a Hanuman is the monkey hero of the Ramayana, and he has a statue there is a statue.
Right outside his office.
Yeah, and he looks like that statue came to life. I mean, big chest, powerful, big
Muscles.
jaw,
Yeah.
and just his energy was like,
Ferocious.
oh,
He was friends with Mayor.
yes, he was. He was.
They were in the Elks Club together.
Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, I did get one of these stories from him that so Sita is captured and imprisoned on Sri Lanka. Hanuman, we could do a whole thing on Hanuman. He can fly, and he leaps over the ocean, and he is looking for Sita so they can rescue her. And he allows himself to be captured by one of Ravana's guards. and he's dragged, before into Ravana's presence, and Ravana is sitting up on a big high throne, kind of looking down at this captive. But because he has superpowers, he can pretty much do anything. So Hanuman begins to make his tail grow. And as the tail grows and it coils under him, he's lifted up and lifted up and lifted up until he's eye level and then even above Ravana. So he just makes his own throne just by using his inner resources. And then when he's had enough of this, he kind of bursts free and runs off. But yeah, I had that I hadn't remembered that one, but Mr. Iyengar tells that story. Yeah.
And also, the title of your book is Flying Monkeys, Floating Stones, and Hanuman is the flying monkey.
Yes. Okay, so flying monkeys, floating stones, due out from Himalayan Institute Press, whenever. But yeah, so because Sita is on an island, they have to cross the ocean somehow. And Hanuman can leap and fly over the ocean, but nobody else can. And at this point, Rama has assembled an army, an animal army of monkeys and bears, mainly. And they try to build a bridge with stones, and of course the stones sink, because that's what stones do. But Hanuman, who's a great, great devotee of Rama, has the habit of writing Rama's name wherever he is. In fact, there are pictures of him pulling open his chest, and there is Rama's picture. Rama and Sita are in his heart, and his name is written on Hanuman's bones. Anyway, Hanuman is sort of just writing Rama, Rama, and he writes it on a stone and tosses it in the water, and the stone floats. Yes. So everybody goes, hey, and they all start. So the other monkeys fly off, get these stones, bring them in, write the Lord's name, and there they have their bridge. So that's what, so flying monkeys, floating stones, more wisdom tales for modern yogis is the book that I'm working on now. Okay.
Now, when you step out of Lakshman's magic circle here, I just want you to know, if you have any trouble with Ravana, we're here for you.
Thank you.
But she's been slayed, hasn't he?
What?
Hasn't he been slayed?
Oh, Ravana?
Yeah.
Well,
At that time.
Yes.
Back again is Trump, but.
Yeah, no, he is slain, and there's a little backstory to that, as there is to most Indian stories, because on one hand,
What's the statement or question?
oh, isn't Ravana killed? Yes, he is.
Minimum said he was on the fourth plane.
But one of the backstories to this is that he wants to be killed by the Lord. And so this whole thing, or it may not be only about that, but the fact that that Rama kills him, he's liberated. Which is really, so this whole, there's this exile and adventures and all this stuff goes on, and ultimately, in his way, he's a great devotee also, just as Hanuman is.
He's the Colonel Irani
The Colonel Irani of the Ramayana, there you go, yeah. Okay, so now I'm really going to stop talking. Yes?
Question. I've always, since quite young, been fascinated with this idea of flying monkeys. And the other night, I think it was on Netflix, I resubscribed, and there's this fabulous story from China about a flying monkey who's got all these powers. And he has this huge chest, and he's magical, and he can do all sorts of stuff and fly.
That's
And
Hanuman.
So,
Yeah.
and then there's a book called Monkey, and I don't know if it relates to Hanuman.
Yes.
The Chinese, it's not Indian,
Yeah.
it's not,
Yeah, but
well,
the
Buddha.
Ramayana
So
is-
it's,
yeah,
but this is
it's-
Buddhism, this is in the, I think the background is Buddhism, but I just would like you to talk more about flying monkeys and as I love that phrase, backstory. What's the backstory of how the monkeys began to fly? I know some do, they fly through treetops, certain species. But just can you say some more about flying monkeys?
Well, I can't say just a little. The thing is, that is Hanuman. The thing is, the story of the Ramayana and this monkey superhero is throughout Southeast Asia. So, yeah, I mean, he might have a different name, or he might not, but
He doesn't have that name.
And Monkey King has a lot of different adventures,
Uh-huh.
and he's not associated with a god. He's associated with a Buddhist monk. But anyway, that's
Okay.
But yeah,
So so it is a parallel. It's not.
in a way,
Yeah.
I mean,
There's got to be a lot of
obviously.
confusion though, because it's all over. Hanuman is in Indonesia and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Though
Monkey
not
King
China,
is not
maybe. Yeah.
the same story, but maybe some offshoot. It's quite possible.
Well, I think the thing is they do seem to fly. They leap through the air. They're so human in so many ways that, of course, people would be fascinated. Yeah.
So to talk then, let's stick with Hanuman. Can you talk a little bit about his origins or the backstory of Hanuman and how he came to fly like that?
Nope, you're going to have to read the book.
I want to buy one.
Well, he's not in this book, but the next
one.
one. Yeah, but you can buy one of these.
Yeah.
Yeah, $14.95. If you don't have it and you want your own copy. Yeah.
Aren't there flying monkeys for sale at JCPenney? Okay, never mind, sorry.
They're a milk picture.
And maybe because Jamie's here too, can you tell us, I understood that, in fact, people have challenged me, so now I'm but that Meherji said, or that Erich said in Manjali Hall that Baba had promised Hanuman that he would have his own empire because of his assistance in retrieving Sita, and that she then became Queen Victoria, that Hanuman became Queen Victoria. So I wanted to get some clarity, that's why I'm bringing it up.
Okay, that's not Hanuman.
What is that?
That is, okay, this is when Sita was imprisoned, on Lanka. She was guarded by women demons and relatives of Ravana's. One of these women demons, Trijata, I think her name was very good to Sita, and later on, but also kind of had a crush on Rama. This is a story from Upasani Maharaj, and it gets a little murky. But basically, because she had been kind to Sita, and because she almost wanted to be Sita. She wanted to be the queen of Rama's kingdom. She was reborn as Queen Victoria.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But there is a thing where, the monkeys who rescued, I'd have to really look this up, but the monkeys who rescued Sita were reborn as the British. Yes.
This is from Upasani Maharaj, and at that time it was colonial India, so they were ruling India.
Right. And because they had done a good thing, they had restored Brahma's kingdom, they were kind to Sita, they got to rule that kingdom for 100 years. That was kind of their reward. And there's a bunch of details that I can't come up with at the moment about that. But So they got to rule Rama's kingdom, and they were the Brits.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.